Hello, everyone. It's nice to see all of you who are able to be with us today. Welcome to CMB Regional Centers webinar, EB5 Due Diligence, Making Sense of Projects. We've muted your audio and disabled video. We'll be keeping audio off during our event today. We're going to allow just another moment or two for the attendees that are just joining us to settle in. Thank you for your patience and thank you for being here. Hello to all of our attendees. I am Andrew Radosevich, Global Market Specialist for CMB Regional Centers. I'll be your host for today's event. On behalf of CMB Regional Centers, a warm welcome to all of you. We are thrilled to have so many of you who are able to join us today, and it's truly our pleasure to have you here. We're delighted to present today EB5 Due Diligence, Making Sense of Projects. We sincerely hope you find tremendous value in our discussions today. We have some distinguished panelists to lead our conversations today. First, Mr. Matt Hogan, Vice President of Project Development with CMB Regional Centers. Matt oversees CMB's team responsible for the identification, due diligence, and underwriting of the projects receiving loans from each of CMB's EB5 partnerships. Matt and his team are instrumental in the maturation of CMB's project offerings. Matt's been with CMB since 2011. Next, our very special guest, Mr. Mark Davies. Mr. Davies is dual qualified in the United States and the United Kingdom. He is the global managing partner and founder of Davies Associates and chairs the firm's investor visa team, which focuses on EB5, L1, E2, EB1C, citizenship by investment, and other business investor visa solutions. As former general counsel, Mark is relied on as primary counsel to corporations, investors, nonprofits, and businesses of all size. CMB has always encouraged our investors to work with the best immigration lawyers over the years so that their interests and EB5 goals are best taken care of. Although Mark and his firm aren't the only attorneys that we work with at CMB, Mark and his team have been longtime friends of ours and have assisted many investors to realize their EB5 dreams with CMB. Today, we're going to be proceeding a bit differently than one of our traditional webinars. Matt and Mark both share unique perspectives on today's topic of conducting proper due diligence on an EB5 project. And we're going to have them create an insightful conversation that will, the intention of sparking some additional questions from you in the attendance. Our goal in hosting this event is simple. We want you, the potential EB5 investor, to be savvy about how to approach and dissect an EB5 project, what questions you should be asking, and how to make sense of what's really important to you while making an EB5 investment. We'll then look forward to an interactive Q&A following Matt and Mark's discussion. And some of you have already sent in questions ahead of our event today. We will be starting with those questions first, but we encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A buttons located in the controls for today's webinar. We'll be addressing them during our Q&A. So please be patient if you're asking questions during the event. We'll try to address them, but we're going to probably hold most of them until the end of the event today. This event is primarily going to be focused on the Q&A portion. So again, we do encourage that you ask questions. And then just one final reminder that your audio and your video is going to be muted for the entirety of today's event. So Matt and Mark, would you please kick off today's event? Say hello to everyone.
Hello, thanks for joining us here today. My name is Matt Hogan, as Andrew introduced me. I'm CMB's Vice President of Project Development. I'm very happy to be here today.
Hi, this is Mark. Similarly, very happy to be here and looking forward to a chat about a topic that Matt and I both feel about quite strongly, I know.
So there's a few topics that we're going to cover today, gentlemen, and it's going to be why due diligence is important, how can I trust the information. I'm sure that's related to the projects or some of the conversations that are had about EB5. Why does the choice of regional center really matter? And then, of course, the interactive Q&A with the attendees. So without further ado, please do what both of you do best.
Sure.
Sure. Well, I'll go ahead and get a jump on this and kind of give everybody a little bit of background. You know, I think the people who are joining us here today, you probably are a little bit familiar with EB5. Obviously, everybody knows the basics of EB5. It requires an investment into a new commercial enterprise, or at least the way CMB structures our investment will require a $900,000 investment into a new commercial enterprise. Each investor is required to create 10 new full-time American jobs. And once they've been able to demonstrate that they've been able to create those jobs, they can demonstrate that their funds were truly invested, fully invested, and made at risk. They can become eligible for a permanent green card. So a green card, permanent residency in the United States. And that would cover themselves, their spouse, and any unmarried children under the age of 21. But when we talk about EB5, we talk about, you know, how do you get to those steps? What are the things that are so important to think about? And what due diligence do I need to do? Because what you need to be aware of is that every regional center is a little bit different. Every project that you might see out there that's taken on by one of these regional centers is going to be a little bit different. They're going to have different challenges that could obstruct your ability to obtain your ultimate goal, which is that permanent green card. And so due diligence takes place on two different sides of the equation, as I like to say. First and foremost, the regional center that you're working with picks the project. You don't necessarily pick the project. And so if you're working with a regional center, typically it's a pre-packaged investment structure. And there's a certain amount of trust that has to go into the regional center having selected a project that's appropriate and structured it appropriately, and having faith in the regional center that they've done their due diligence and that they've properly vetted that developer or the project, that they have a good structure that's going to allow them to create those jobs and be able to return your capital at the end of the day. Because remember, one of the huge benefits of EB5 is that if this is done right, not only will you get your green card, but you'll get your money back, which sets it above and beyond a lot of the other immigration by investment programs around the world. But so that's due diligence on the regional center side when they pick the project. But what I think is incredibly important is not just having faith, not just trusting the regional center, but you personally doing due diligence on that regional center, on the developer they're working with, your own personal due diligence on how the project was structured, and your own personal due diligence on whether or not it's likely that they're going to be able to get you your green card and get you your money back. And that, I think, requires a bit of an education curve. So why is due diligence important? I think that hits it on the head, right? You want to set yourself up for the highest likelihood of success. You want to make sure that you're picking a regional center that's trustworthy. You're picking a project that is structured well, that's a quality opportunity. Because at the end of the day, you want your green card and you want your money back. Mark, jump in.
Sure. So, I mean, I was going to say, you just beat me to what I was going to say. This comes down to, you want your green card and you want your money back. That's why due diligence is important. And, you know, I agree with Matt. You know, perhaps I think there's three kinds of due diligence in EB5, right? I think the first is really looking at the regional center. And there's questions to be asked about the regional center. But the sort of three things that hang off it are three different types of risk. There's a legal risk that the project you're investing in is properly qualified for the EB5 program. So that is pretty difficult for you as an individual to go through. But that's why people have immigration lawyers, because there's a lot of law, there's a lot of case or sort of a moving target, a moving area of different things going on. So type 1 due diligence is really, about, am I going to get my green card? And you're really doing due diligence, like you said, on both the regional center and the project. Good regional centers have less good projects. Excellent projects can have a bad regional center, which messes them up. So you need to do these due diligences on both. So one is the project structured so I'm going to get my green card? 2 is about getting your money back. So I disagree with lots of the immigration lawyers out there that I think that with a project, there are basic real estate law issues in projects. So if you were a domestic US investor and you were investing in a project similar to the EB5 projects available, there is no way that you would invest now nearly $1 million in a project without having a real estate backed project, without having a real estate lawyer look at that project to make sure it's structured so you're properly protected. And unfortunately, a lot of the projects we're seeing right now where people are getting into problems are genuinely projects where we advised our clients of risks in those projects, not to their green card, but in terms of the way they are structured, protecting them in the event of changing economic winds. So a lot of these projects we see right now, I think investments could have been avoided in most of them. So not all of them, there always is a risk, but most of them, just from I'll give you for example, there's a project out there that they didn't have the construction permits, and the construction permits requiring zoning variances. Immigration lawyer won't check for that. That is not an immigration law risk. Although you can argue, because if those things aren't in place, someone's not getting their green card. So you can get into an argument, but generally those would be deemed to be real estate law issues. Any real estate lawyer is going to check a project to make sure they have their construction permits. And if they don't, they're going to flag it for their client. And then it's not up to the lawyer, it's up to the client. But the net result of this is that project can't go ahead. Because the money's not really been spent, people will probably get their money back, or most of it back. But now, big problem, because now clients, if they want to do EB5, are going to have a much longer delay, and they're going to have to reinvest at 900,000 instead of 500,000. So it's very important to do the basic real estate due diligence. Perhaps we can talk about more in detail some of the tricks that some of the regional centers play and developers play in this game, that unless you have experience with the legal side of real estate, you might not see. And then, of course, the third type of due diligence is financial due diligence. Lawyer won't help you with that. That's a question of, do the numbers make sense? Do the numbers make sense? So if I have, for example, an apartment building, right, and assuming that I'm going to rent them at all the rates and everything that's given, do the numbers add up? Do they make sense? Also, given sort of the economic environment, do the budget apartment sales price and occupancy rates make sense? Those are all financial issues. So, I think it's perhaps helpful to think of what types of due diligence are needed and who can help. So that's my long-winded answer to your question, Matt.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I like that you've broke it down into 3 different groups. And, I think it's daunting for any investor, especially, we're fully aware. We've worked with over 5,700 investors from around the world. And we're fully aware that not every EB5 investor is a sophisticated financial, analyst who can break these deals apart and understand every nuance. Nor are they, skilled and trained in immigration law, and are they going to know all of the challenges that could arise from an immigration standpoint. So as part of your due diligence, it's also important that you set yourself up for success and that you have a good team, that you pick a good attorney. You pick you work with maybe a chartered accountant or a CPA that can help you break down and understand kind of some of the other preparatory work that you might need to do to prepare to file. And that, in some instances, it is helpful to have, a third-party person do some due diligence, or someone who's skilled with, who's trained in kind of breaking down the financial aspects of these projects to better understand, do these numbers make sense? The other thing that you always, go ahead, Mark.
No, sorry, I was going to ask you a question. So one of the things I see is this. I see clients who have a broker, right, who is selling projects, and is telling the client, I do the financial due diligence. You know, I work with 2 or 3 clients. I do the financial due diligence. And I think perhaps, you know, you guys know too, it's helpful to think about what is the legal responsibility of someone, of a financial advisor to clients. There's different licenses people can have. You can have one of these series things where someone's just really a salesman, or you can have a RFA, which is a different standard to, there's different standards. So Matt, if you were looking at, if you were doing financial due diligence and bringing someone on board, I guess my question to you is, would you rely on a broker? And if you weren't going to rely on a broker, why? And what qualifications would you look for so that you know the level of responsibility to you under the law is very high?
Sure. So that's a great question. And because I touched on it, sometimes in some instances, if you're not financially savvy, it can really help you to have somebody there who does truly understand all of these aspects, who's going to be able to take a look at it, put another set of eyes on it, and make sure that the project is structured to be financially successful. Mark touches on something that is so important. There are a lot of groups out there that are professional due diligence providers in the EB-5 industry. There are groups that for a fee, typically a fee that not only you pay, but the regional centers pay as well, will break down the EB-5 project and will tell you the things that are positives, the things that are negatives, you know, the things that you need to look out for, or the things that make it a strong project. Mark hits on when he's talking about the brokers, and he's talking about people who are licensed by FINRA or other, securities related bodies in the United States to do due diligence and provide financial advice. Part of the reason why they go get certified is because it also qualifies them to be able to take finder's fees or broker fees from the regional centers. And so what you have to be aware of is that if you go to a website and they're marketing 3, 4, 5 projects, they might be putting a seal of approval on all of those projects and saying, these are strong projects, these are projects that we recommend. But it also might be the only projects that are willing to pay that broker to market their projects. So sometimes there's a marketing function that these brokers provide. And what you have to be aware of is that not only are they, going to do the basics that they need to in order to maintain their licenses, but they're also going to be marketing these projects to you. And they will receive a fee typically from the regional center if you choose their project. So there's sometimes some conflict there. I wouldn't put all of your stock in working with a broker, I guess is a long-winded way of saying it. You need to vet the broker. You need to understand who they are. You need to understand what their track history is. And then you also still need to be able to think for yourself. And so I think it goes into that next layer of adding that extra person, adding that, whether it's a family member, whether it's a colleague, someone who can be trained and a little bit more qualified. One thing that I would mention is that Mark, and this is a little, I guess, shout out to Mark and his firm. Mark himself is not an immigration attorney. Mark has a robust team of professionals at Davies Associates that not only do immigration work, but also do financial due diligence on the projects. And that's a unique fit. And there are some firms that do that. And to be honest with you, that's probably what I would look for. I would look for groups that can help you with both ends of that. That can help you look at what things you need to be aware of from an immigration perspective, but also break down the project from a financial perspective.
So just for clarity, I distinguish between, on that side of things, legal risks that could cause a loss, which we certainly do. We're real estate lawyers as well as immigration lawyers. The financial things, we would rely on someone who's a number cruncher type. And one of the things I say to our clients is, look on that area for someone who's an RFA, because if you look, there's a different legal level of responsibility amongst financial advisors and their level of obligation to basically find risks in projects and their obligations to you as an investor. And so sort of the lowest level is what Matt's referring to, which is a lot of these brokers who really, to tell the truth, to pass that exam, you don't have to really have any financial training whatsoever at all. I've seen the test. It's a multiple choice test, which has got more to do with ethics than it has to do anything to do with financial analysis. So if you're doing someone who's an authorized broker dealer, just be aware that they might actually know nothing whatsoever at all about real estate finance or mezzanine finance. Once you go up to the higher, there's different levels of this. I think the highest level in my mind is the RFA, which I'm not. We're certainly not RFAs, but that registered financial advisor is highly regulated by the US government. Those people have very serious, heavy-hitting experience in analysis and sort of how to put numbers together on these projects. And furthermore, in addition, they have a level of legal responsibility to you as their client that is just sort of way and above. So anyway, that's probably all I have to say on this. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, and I guess I'd throw one last thing in there. It's not to say, I guess it's really like anything. You know, it's not to say that there aren't groups that perform due diligence for EB-5 projects that truly are brokers that don't do a great job and don't do, you know, that don't run a completely ethical practice. Those groups are out there. There are also bad actors. And so one of the things that I want to be able to, you know, consistently bring through in this conversation is that you still need to do your due diligence. You still need to be personally comfortable with the decisions that you're making. And know that if you just entirely leave it in somebody else's hands, things can go wrong sometimes. And we hope that they won't, but sometimes they can. And so when it comes to our own projects, and I guess this will serve as a good transition point, you know, to tell you a little bit about CMB, we're one of the oldest active regional centers in the industry. We always like to say, you know, we're not just some mom and pop shop in EB-5. We've been around since 1997. We have about 50 employees in-house between our two offices here in Rock Island, Illinois, and then down in Dallas, Texas. We have a team of financial analysts. We have a team of economists that underwrite the projects from both the financial aspects in terms of, is it a viable project? Will you get your money back? Will it perform? Will it pay its debt service? Those sorts of things. But then our economists look at them from all the EB-5 perspectives. Is it in a proper TEA, targeted employment area? Is it set up to create jobs? And is it is it more likely than not to create the jobs that you need? And so we have a team of professionals that have done these for years and years and years. And so the level of due diligence that we do on our projects before we ever put them out on the market is significant. And what I would tell you is that while you're doing your own due diligence, the regional center, any regional center that you work with, and CMB will certainly do this, should be an open book. They should be telling you everything that you need to know, providing any document that you want to be able to see. And this can be crucially important. And I know that there are instances out there, and Mark can probably speak to some of these, where the regional centers have been more reluctant to provide certain due diligence information that could have been pivotal to whether or not the project was going to be successful.
I think, Matt, you're raising two separate points here that are very important. So I hear regional centers say, it doesn't matter what regional center you choose, it's all about the project. I hear small regional centers say, you're better off with a small family regional center that cares. This is an area where I distinctly disagree for the reasons that you're articulating. Proper due diligence, right? Now, I'm not saying a small regional center is dishonest, but I've got one in mind that's not dishonest and they try to do the right thing. But it's a family. It's a little family that run a regional center. And they don't have economists in-house. They don't have real estate experts in-house. They don't have all of those things. So I think we were talking about financial due diligence, I think, and legal. One of the things is that the regional center is going to do a lot of that screening work. So you have to ask a very serious question when I'm looking at a project. Is the regional center qualified to have done that screening work? And you need to ask. I always ask, who's your economist? Now, in the case of CMB, one of the things that we do as a law firm, really before we start working with any regional center, is we physically visit their headquarters. And instead of just listening to, we've got this person, we've got that person, I always ask, can I meet these people? And, we just make it seem like it's friendly. And it partly is, but also we're checking, do these people really exist? And if you chat to them briefly, do they sound like they actually know what they're talking about? And then we can check their backgrounds. So we've done that with CMB and some others, to tell the truth. And I really do think that there's a risk to going with a smaller regional center, especially some of these startup regional centers. There's a recent example of a regional center that got big press. They were even financial experts, but they came from a different era of Wall Street. Basically, the area that they worked in slowed down. So they're like, okay, let's start a regional center. So they did that, but they knew nothing about being a real estate finance and being an asset manager in real estate finance. This caused them to completely mismanage the escrow accounts, which led to every single EB5 case being denied. So that, I think you could have screened out that risk if you're an investor, simply by looking at, is this regional, do they have the right people on board? Not only to screen the project up front, which was sort of my initial comment, but secondly, if something goes not quite right, and every regional center sooner or later will have a project where something goes not quite right. And then what happens to you as an investor is critical upon the ability of the regional center to, one, detect that problem early, and two, address it. So to me, actually, I'm more comfortable with regional centers where they've had a project where something's gone not quite right, but they've proven the ability, one, to proactively detect the problem earlier before it becomes, a big issue. And two, they've demonstrated the ability to address that issue and resolve it so that investors are not harmed. So that's my sort of contribution to that point, Matt.
Yeah, and that is a great point. And I would tell you, in 2020, with all of the challenges that COVID-19 and the pandemic and how it's impacted the economy here in the United States, that's got to be one of the most important things that you need to think about when you do your due diligence. So you start with the project, you start with the regional center, these basic things that you need to look at. But then you also do have to be thinking about, what if things go wrong? Or what if there are challenges along the way? We structure all of our projects as a loan. And that loan agreement has certain terms and conditions that the borrower needs to abide by. But it's our duty to enforce those terms and conditions. And so we have a team of professionals that not only monitor our loans from a construction standpoint, but then when they're in the operational phase, we monitor all the reporting information. We can detect things that come up along the way. But we also have the team that's capable of stepping in and handling some of those problems, or pushing those borrowers to perform, or working with those borrowers to figure out how to make sure the projects remain on the right track. Right now in 2020, and I think into the next couple of years in EB5, you're going to hear a lot of horror stories about some of these smaller regional centers, or these what I like to call fly-by-night regional centers that were set up just for one regional center project. They took on that project, they funded it, they got their money, and now they're not interested in the program anymore. And frankly, they don't care about having a history where they build a reputation and a track record. They just wanted their original project done, and now they're out of EB5. I think over the next couple of years, you're going to hear a lot of horror stories about regional centers like that, or developers walking away from their commitments to those EB5 investors. Mm-hmm. Projects that go through trouble during COVID-19, I think especially the hospitality industry is hit particularly hard. Many, many hotel projects out there in the industry right now. And there's going to be a lot of them that face challenges. And if you don't have a regional center that's set up to be able to face those challenges, it's going to be a huge problem for you down
because,
the road.
Another point, Matt, I think is, projects can be worded differently. But I think in every single project I've ever seen, the regional center as the general partner is set up. So really, it's very difficult for investors to do anything unless it's through the regional center who's the general partner. So literally, when you sign most of these projects, you are emasculating lots of your individual rights to the regional center to act on your behalf.
Right.
So if the regional center goes bankrupt, we can talk about financial solvency of regional centers and why big regional centers make sense. But the regional center has financial stresses. If for some reason its license is canceled, if they just don't have the competence as we're talking about, they may not be able to act. And I would say there's another factor to throw in there, which is these combined regional center developers. So the industry sort of accepts that there's no conflict of interest between trusting a regional center and who's also the developer up front. I would like to be on record that personally I disagree with that, but that would be the general industry view. But once, what happens as Matt's describing is something goes not quite right. Well, now the regional center is obligated to protect investors, to act in their interest against itself. So it raises this curious thing where the regional center is now negotiating against itself. The regional center may now need to sue itself. So I think, you know, what Matt said is right, and I'm just flushing out sort of a few little details of when you're thinking about regional centers and competence, you know, they're the ones that you are trusting to act in your interests. Now, again, there's a big mistake in the industry to say that as an individual investor, there's nothing you can do if the project goes wrong. But you can do things. But because the regional center is set up to protect your interests, it becomes a whole lot more difficult. And really, you know, so I think this is a serious thing to bear in mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. There, you know, what we call them in the industry is these vertically integrated regional centers, these developer-driven regional centers. And, you know, there are some out there that have, you know, fine track records that are set up and to avoid, you know, conflicts of interest that may arise. And, you know, they're ethical people. Unfortunately, there are also a lot out there that are developers who saw EB-5, you know, after the Great Recession as this new cheap source of financing when the capital markets were a little bit more tight. And they said, well, wait a minute, I can put one of these EB-5 regional center projects together. And in those days, people ran over to China or India or Vietnam or some of these places that were becoming successful markets for EB-5. And their hope was that they'd run over there and the investors would come running at them with fistful of cash. And unfortunately, in some situations, they were able to attract investors that wanted to go into their projects, whether it be through clever marketing schemes or, you know, a great location or whatever it might be, a project that on its face looked like a good opportunity. But some of those projects were just doomed to fail from the beginning because of the conflicts that arose. And some of them, to the outsider looking in, seemed pretty obvious. If you have a developer that only started an EB-5 regional center to raise money for its big project, you have to question whether or not that regional center cared enough about EB-5 to be around after that project was completed. Or as I've been mentioning, if that project were to go through trouble or to struggle or to fail, you know, whether or not they were going to continue to be around, or if they were just going to walk away from EB-5 altogether. You know, CMB is very different. You know, we set ourselves up as a third-party regional center. So we are not affiliated to any one developer. We work with a number of different developers. Sure, we have developers that we've worked with more than once. Once we've been able to, you know, establish a working relationship and that developer has performed, you know, it's good to be able to have some familiarity with some groups that you trust. But we always keep that separation because we know if something goes wrong, someone needs to be an advocate for those EB-5 investors. And if that borrower, you know, fails to meet the terms and conditions of their loan, the EB-5 investors need somebody to be able to go back and protect them and push that borrower to perform. And so it was very important for us to be able to do that because we're not in it for just one project. We weren't in it for just two projects. Right now, we've taken on over 75 EB-5 partnerships. We've been doing this for over 20 years. We want to do it for another 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And so our reputation is incredibly important to us. Making sure that we do right by our investors is incredibly important to us because if we fail our investors now, no investors are going to trust us in the future.
I think, you know, Matt, I've advised many clients to do something that I don't know why clients don't do it. Doesn't make any sense. In the world of the internet, it's very easy to check anybody out. So if I was an EB-5 investor, right, maybe I have a lawyer, fine, I can rely on them, maybe this, maybe that. But one of the things I'd absolutely do is check out the principles of the regional center. Absolutely. And sometimes when you do due diligence on the regional center, you find all kinds of connections linking the same people to projects and things. But it's very easy to do a background check on the people who are running the regional center, on the people who are running the development company. And as an investor, you should. And it's not very difficult in these days, right? One of the things about the information technology age is easy. If you want to take it to the next level, you can do what any company, any corporate business would do. If I didn't know Matt and I was interested in entering into a business arrangement with him, bluntly, I would hire a private investigation company. And it doesn't cost very much money. It costs a couple of $100s to have them check Matt out. And I'll know everything I ever wanted to know about Matt, and probably including all kinds of pictures and things. But the point is,
All good stuff.
As an investor, you can take responsibility for some of this yourself. You should do, and very easy to do, basic due diligence on, if you've never heard of me, check me out on the internet. If you are suspicious, check out that I really graduated from the law school that I say I do, etc. And on the business side, absolutely, check out the development company yourself. It's very easy to do. Yeah. Find out, do they deliver projects on time? On the regional center side, it's so easy to check people out.
And it jumps back to that bullet point. How can I trust the information? You'd be surprised what a simple Google search can reveal. Some of the largest regional centers in this industry, if you Google Google the head of their regional center, the principal, the founder of their regional center, you'll see some stuff that might shock you. There's projects in the market right now that if you Google the developer that the regional center is working with, you'll see that they've been involved in prior litigation. I can tell you that there is one developer out there right now that we worked with on early projects. We had to sue that developer for misappropriation of funds. We ended up settling with that developer, but we pursued that developer, and we're going to have success for those clients. That developer shifted course and is now working with a different regional center because we won't work with them anymore. You can find that out through a simple Google search, but there's another thing that I also like to mention. There's some stuff that's a little bit harder to find, and that is, how is the regional center, actually handling the money? How is the regional center, allocating the funding that comes into the partnership? Are they controlling it, based on the terms of the documents that you've subscribed to? Are they moving it to the borrower in the fashion in which they said they were? When it comes back from the borrower, is it going back into the partnership? Are all those things being done appropriately? And then also, what are their actual numbers, their approval numbers? All of those things are hard to figure out. There's a lot of regional centers out there that'll say, I've got 100% success. I've never had a petition denial. Now, I would tell you right now, unless it's a brand new regional center that's only filed a few petitions, likelihood is that most of the larger regional centers out there have had individual investors who have received denials of their petitions for source of funds related issues. And so that's why it's pivotal that you work with a high quality immigration attorney. But I can tell you, CMB as a regional center has never had a project denial, meaning we've never had one of our partnerships be denied on the merits of the way in which we structured the project or the way in which we've documented job creation. And why I'm bringing this up and to the question of how can I trust this information, we actually have all of that information that I just mentioned audited on an annual basis. We started it in 2015 with our 2014 information. We have an outside third-party accounting firm called BKD audit all of that information. And when you're doing due diligence on CMB, we can gladly share that information so that you can see it across all of our partnerships. And then when you actually have become an investor in those partnerships, if you want to see the annual audit, we can show you the annual audit so that you know how the funding has progressed, how the investors have received approvals. And we share that information willingly. But if you want to see it from a third party that's been able to put a set of eyes on it, we do that. And I think we were the first regional center to do that, and there's been a few others who have done it, noteworthy regional centers. I think every regional center should do it because that's the level of transparency that you should look for when you're working with a regional center.
Right. I mean, trust the information too. I mean, I do think that, be self-serving. I do think the lawyer has a role in that. If I was an investor, I would ask the lawyer, have you ever been to that regional center and visited with it? Well, because if they haven't, I would say go yourself, right? As an investor, you're investing $1 million now. Go to the regional center yourself. If for some reason you don't want to, at least make sure your lawyer's been there, right? There's so many, over the history of the world, not just EB5, there's so many scams where, there's just lots of paper and things. It's very difficult. When I go to a regional center, I usually try to basically call them the day before, if it's a new one, if it's a small one, and say, hey, I happen to be in town, can I drop by? And I do that for a reason, because then it's very difficult for them to, pull some kind of wool over someone's eyes, right? If you just turn up and everybody's there and everything's working, you can see, it gives you a certain amount of confidence. So when you say, how can I trust the information? I really do think that physically visiting the regional center and physically visiting the project site, there are, not everyone, but there are very, very few projects our clients have invested in that I haven't been to. You know, I went down to Dallas and with Matt's team and saw their projects, and they took us up in a helicopter because one of their developers literally owns half of Dallas, it looks like. So you can't see half of Dallas by walking it or in a car. So we went up in a helicopter and we went and took a look at sort of the project inventory and things. Yeah. We do not have any investors in their hotel project in Tennessee, excuse me, not in Tennessee, in Charlotte, North Carolina. But I was there, and part of the touch it is, you know, I want to know, do the regional centers, are they real? Are they open? Are they operating? So I stayed in the hotel so I could see it. And that hotel was doing, it seemed to me, doing very well. It was doing better than its competitors across the street, that's for sure. So I do think, you know, I began my career in distressed real estate finance. And I thought I was going to do billion-dollar transactions and it was going to be sexy and things. And the first thing I was taught as a junior lawyer, it doesn't matter how many pieces of paper you see. And I remember they gave me a pair of Wellington boots as my gift. And the point was, doesn't matter how many deals you see, how many billions of dollars are involved. If it's a real estate deal, you put on your Wellington boots and you go to the site and you walk it. So I would demand for my lawyer to have seen the project and walked the site, unless they can come up with a very good excuse why not. So can you trust the information? Everything that Matt said is true. You can check things out, but there's, you know, nothing beats sort of the old fashioned, have I been there, have I seen it? And for the real estate, have I walked it, have I touched it? Do you agree, Matt?
I completely agree. And it brings back kind of a funny story. You know, several years ago, we had an investor ask to visit our office. And by the way, we have investors visit our office all the time. And whether they be prospects, meaning, you know, they're still doing their due diligence, they're choosing between a couple of different projects. A lot of times they'll want to come visit. And we love having people come visit our office because we can introduce them to our staff. And it really does set us apart, the team that we have. And so whether you want to come visit us here in Rock Island or down in Dallas, we'd welcome that with open arms. But it reminds me of a story of several years ago. We had an investor, this time it was a client, prospect selecting a project. And they said, hey, I'm choosing between two different regional center projects. I'm going to visit the first one on Tuesday. I'm going to visit you on Friday. And Friday, the individual comes in and they look around and they, you know, meet our team and they, you know, sit in our CEO's office. They sit in our senior vice president's office. We kind of take them on a little tour to meet the rest of the staff. And, you know, the whole time they barely said two words and they were just kind of stunned. And then they turned around and they said, you know, I think I'm good. This is, you know, I've done all the due diligence on the documents. I've asked all the questions. Your team has, you know, been great. They've helped me throughout this entire process. And I wanted to meet both regional center operators. And he said, honestly, I'm blown away. I'm going to move forward with CMB. And he said, you know, I have to tell you, I'm impressed by your operation here because I went to go visit the other regional center on Tuesday and their office was just a desk in the owner's garage.
That's surprising. And
so, you know, I guess it speaks to, you know, one, we do like having investors come visit us. I think it's important that we get to meet the people and to a lot of people, it's tough right now with COVID, but it's important that you get to look somebody in the eye and you can feel comfortable about the group that you're going to invest in, because this is one of the biggest decisions of your life. But why is it so important that they actually took that step? Well, because what if they wouldn't have visited us? What if they would have picked that other group? I don't know what their project was. I don't know what their track history was at that point in time. But clearly it didn't put on a good show for them to go visit that other regional center and find out it was a one-person operation that simply had a desk in their garage. And it was a, you know, here, I'll open the overhead door, you know, welcome to my office. And, you know, there are a lot of regional centers out there, especially in the early days of EB-5. And then the other thing I'd mention is that we have investors visit our sites all the time. And you should do that. You know, again, it's challenging right now. We're actually going to do some virtual tours of our upcoming, our project that we currently have available. It's a industrial logistics development with 2 projects in Southern California. And, And we've had some people say, hey, I really would have liked to visit the site. And we fully understand that. So I think we're going to send a team out there to do some virtual tours of those sites if people aren't comfortable actually going and visiting them. But if they are comfortable going and visiting them, we'll go out of our way to accommodate those, because it's so important that you actually get comfortable with the decision that you're making.
Another thing, right, about this due diligence point is you have to be just aware of the work that the lawyer's doing. If they say immigration only, then they bear no responsibility if there's some issue with the real estate side of things. If they say that I'm going to review the real estate side, and for example, just to make up an example, suppose that you're building a warehouse and it's got a tenant and it's 100% free rented to the tenant, right? There's a couple of things that could happen with that. You know, first of all, this doesn't affect your green card, but one of the things that could happen is that there's a loophole in the lease that says something like, if certain ratios are not maintained, the deal's off. Or it may say tenant has the right to cancel up until 24 hours before the until the CO is issued, or something like that. CO means certificate of occupancy. If that's the case, really, the regional center is grossly misrepresenting to you to say that the building is pre-leased, because whilst there may be a lease, it can be effectively cancelled at any time. So one of the things that the real estate lawyer will do is they will read that lease and they will make sure that there's no, you know, every lease has get out clauses. Obviously, if I enter into a lease for a building and I want it next year, but it's not built for another 100 years, you know, I'm going to be able to get out of that. But that there's just usual contingencies in the lease. If I don't tell my clients about that and I'm saying I'm reviewing it, then my malpractice insurer, we just had this come up, covers my real estate work. And my malpractice insurer just asked a lot of questions about this real estate work that we're doing. And we flushed it out in a great amount of detail to them and told them what we're doing so that my investors are covered. So if someone's doing immigration only, there's no coverage. No one's checking these legal issues on the real estate side. If I'm reading that lease and there's a flaw in it and it causes the project to fail and to use your money, then lose your money, then there's arguably a remedy against my law firm for not doing our job properly and finding the risk. And if that's true, then you're covered by our malpractice insurer potentially for your losses. So point is, when it looks at this, just be cognizant of the work that different people are doing with you. Again, when you look at the financial advisors, if you're an RFA, there's some financial responsibility to you if you miss things. If you're a broker, there probably isn't. So just look at who are your advisors and what are their responsibilities to you as well.
Yeah, couldn't be more important. And again, one of the things that we always take so seriously is that we work with a lot of different attorneys, but we also over the years have been able to see attorneys that do a great job and attorneys that, you know, maybe have done some things that have proven to be a bit unethical in the past. And we would let you know if you're going down the wrong path with an attorney that you may want to reconsider. It's your choice, and that's important to us. But the the attorney that you pick is going to be incredibly important because they're going to be an advocate for you through this entire process. And so it's really important to work with somebody who's trustworthy, who's got a track record of their own, and who's going to do these due diligence and who should ask the regional center the tough questions on your behalf.
I think, you know, also, Matt, you know, thinking about the projects, right? The thing to look for in the projects, you mentioned earlier about asking for certain documents. So you can argue that from an immigration perspective, you don't need to see certain documents, but from a preservation of capital, any lawyer, and not financial advisor, lawyer who's representing an investor in a project is, for example, just to choose an example, going to want to see the intercreditor agreement. An intercreditor agreement lays out sort of basically the rights of the different creditors to the investment, the different parties who have lent money to the investment. So that's incredibly important to understand how well you are protected. Arguably, things in that could impact your green card eligibility too, but let's leave that aside. That's an incredibly important document. Our experience is some of the regional centers we ask won't even give us that document. So it exists, but they won't tell us what your rights are. So we then have to tell our client, sorry, you're entering into this. It's a bit of a black box, really. We don't really know what's going to happen in certain events, and they won't tell us. So to me, that's a bit of a red flag, right? You,
It
as
should
an
be.
investor,
Yeah.
you can choose to proceed. That's up to you. It's not my job as a lawyer to tell you to invest or not to invest. I just alert clients to things. So
Yeah.
when you read that intercreditor, there can be significant risks in it to you from the perspective of, are you positioned to get your money back? Immigration lawyers generally don't ask for that. Another complaint I have from regional centers is, no other lawyers ask for that document. Why are you making a problem? Why are you asking for it? And my response always is, well, that's because my client wants to know that they're going to get their money back and they're properly protected. So anyway, asking for the right documents on these projects from the regional center is key. And, you know, it was really shocking to me. There's another issue called subordination risk. So I will not name the regional center because I think the general counsel is a lovely person and I know her and she's really nice. But I asked her about their subordination language. And she said, well, I'm an immigration lawyer. I don't know what you're talking about. And their documents had not addressed this issue. And it was just a lack of sophistication. They were not bad people. It was just a lack of sophistication. And it was a huge project too, with a major real estate developer. So, you know, point is you need a regional center who does it properly, but then you need somebody to champion on your behalf and ask for the right things. And if the regional center won't give them to you, then you can draw your conclusions from that.
Yeah, you mentioned a red flag. Those things would be huge red flags to me. If I was doing due diligence on a project and I was asking questions that seemed relevant and the regional center wouldn't turn them over, especially on documents that exist, you know, that's a huge problem. And like I said, the attorney that you work with, they should be asking the tough questions of the regional center. And if the regional center can't answer those questions, it shows either some dishonesty or just disingenuousness on the side of the regional center, or maybe some lack of sophistication on the side of the regional center because they don't want to get into a hole that they can't dig themselves out of. And you know, we've seen that happen throughout the years in EB-5. One of the things is there are standard clauses in a lot of documents that could be perceived to negatively impact the investors. So I think it's fair to ask the regional center, if these scenarios play out and this clause comes into play, what's the regional center's plan? You know, Mark mentioned subordination clauses in there. I think of the project that we currently have available right now. You know, in a situation where the borrower runs out of capital for some reason, there's massive cost overruns or there's challenges to construction, they have a completion guarantee. They're required to put in additional equity. So that equity comes in behind the EB-5 investors to complete that project. Additionally, they overfund the projects to the, in the beginning with additional equity so that the likelihood is that even if the EB-5 raise falls short, there's enough capital there to complete the project.
That's a great example because there's another project I can think of where it's completely the opposite, or was completely the opposite. Basically, the document said that the investors agreed in advance that further money could be borrowed and it would leapfrog ahead of them to complete the project, which is a really serious issue. And then the regional center hated us for pointing this out to investors, but
Sure.
That's completely the opposite. So when people say you kind of have to take the project as is, you've just, I think, highlighted a fantastic example of how two different document sets in major projects are completely different.
Yeah.
One puts the new monies ahead of the investors, which means that you're pushed down, you're lower priority to the assets.
Yeah.
Or Matt's example, where the money's going to go behind you, so it makes you sort of even more stable, if you like, in the capital stack.
Yeah, and these are the things that a regional center that's truly doing their job and thinking about how to structure these to put the investors, to give the investors the highest likelihood of success. These are the things that they think through. We've been doing this for a long time, and we know that, the investor's success is our success. Their failure is ultimately going to be our failure as well. So we've got to put them in a position to succeed, and leaving them to chance by saying that, hey, we have no backup plan. We have no plan moving forward. If we can't complete the EB-5 raise, the developer's just going to go out and dump on a bunch of debt and shut us down the capital structure. It doesn't exactly give you the greatest likelihood of success in getting your capital back. It negatively impacts your collateral position. And if they're unable to secure that additional debt, negatively impacts your ability to create the jobs that you need to be successful and get your green card. So these are things that are hugely important. It's not just the documents. It even goes outside the documents. If these things occur, how's the regional center going to handle them?
So Matt, if I'm an investor, right, and let's suppose for the sake of this argument, this question, that I have no experience whatsoever with real estate finance in the United States, right? None. So I don't even know when you say I don't even know what you're talking about when you say intercreditor. Sure. So what should I do to make sure that when I go into one of these projects, I'm, getting trusted information and advice?
Yeah. So if you're an unknowing investor, right? Let's say you come from the medical field and this is kind of your first dabble into kind of a more sophisticated financial transaction, or let's say, let's say you're a younger student and you're doing due diligence on your own because you've, inherited some capital that's going to allow you to make this investment, or you have a family member that's going to gift you the money to be able to make this investment. You're going to need some help, right? So you're going to need some outside help. You're going to need to rely upon your counsel. As Mark mentioned before, the counsel that you choose should go above and beyond, not only looking at the immigration risks, but looking at how the business risks not only could impact the immigration risks, but how they could impact your ability to actually, get your money back. These are all things that they should be able to look at because they're very basic in some instances. But when I think of, just basic due diligence, basic 101 due diligence, you should come into these conversations having read the information that's available to you and be prepared to ask questions and ask for documentation. If a document is referenced, you should ask for it. That scenario you gave, or that example you gave, Mark, of a regional center not being willing to share the intercreditor agreement really shocks me. If there's an intercreditor agreement, they should ask for it. And if the regional center won't provide it, then you should ask why. Why is it that you won't provide it? One of the things that we see regional centers do a lot is they use the structure of their deal to help market the deal. And they might march around and say, you have a first lien collateral interest, a first lien collateral interest. Well, that can mean a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a first deed of trust, meaning you're collateralized by a direct ownership interest in the property itself. You might have a first lien on some, pledge of cash flow that comes out. You might have a first lien on the ownership interest in the entity that owns the project, but there still might be another lender ahead of you in the capital structure. These are all things that you need to be prepared to just continue to dig down in and then ask your attorney for some assistance in understanding what these things mean.
Can I chip in on the first lien point?
Sure.
So one of the things that I think is good is this. Obviously, having high priority in a capital stack with a valuable asset is a good thing to have, right? However, most people are not going to be sort of aggressively managing the project and looking at what's going on. I always think if you have a bank in there with a little bit of skin in the game, right, in the primary position, and they're a bank who really knows real estate finance, there's some advantage to the investor, because then that bank, they almost certainly have a real estate loan team that's monitoring what's going on with that deal, right? They're watching it. They've screened it as well. Whatever screening processes you may go through, you're then sort of, there's no direct trust relationship between you and the primary lender. It doesn't exist. And their interest could be adverse to you on some of the points in the documents, right? Clear. However, in terms of the basics of, is this project really there? Does it make sense? The bank will have done that due diligence in a great amount of detail. So you sort of can piggyback on that a little tiny bit, I think. And then in terms of monitoring what goes on with the project, they almost certainly have a credit committee or a loan committee, right? Who, depending on the size of the exposure, are demanding reports very frequently on what's going on. So I do think that these people who say first lien, sometimes a first lien might be great. You need to really look at what it means and what's going on. But in other, especially big, complicated projects, I think there may be an advantage to having a responsible lender in place. Responsible lender means a vanilla type lender too, not someone who's going to play sort of clever tricks. So, if you, I don't know, what do you think about that, Matt?
I think that's a great point, Mark. And it kind of goes back to me talking about CMB and how we're set up. We have a large team. We have a large team of professionals that work on these projects day in and day out, that monitor the ongoing projects. We visit the sites. We talk to the borrowers frequently. We require reporting information. Most of our deals are mezzanine debt behind another senior lender. And we literally piggyback their expertise because we open lines of communication. We maintain open lines of communication with those lenders on what they're saying on the deals. especially right now in COVID-19 and everything that's happened on these projects, we're able to leverage in some instances those senior lenders for their perspective on what's happening in the deal. A lot of regional centers will go out and they'll figure out a way to secure a first lien position. But again, if they're not a team that is sophisticated, if they're not a robust group of individuals that have the time, energy, and ability to monitor these deals appropriately, then what's the point of having the first lien? And so, they may not be able to identify issues until that project has gone so far in the wrong direction that it's devalued or diminished the overall value of their lien position. One of the biggest things that a bank does is they identify very early on when they think a project is going wrong or going south so that they can mitigate further risk of loss to the value of their collateral. And that's something that we try and do from the position that we're in, but we also know the senior lenders do it as well. So having the first lien, it's really only as good as your ability to service that at that lien position.
Correct.
So, well, I think we've reached an hour. We've been talking about due diligence for an hour. Andrew, would you like to open it up for some Q&As from the attendees?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matt and Mark. That was a great conversation and discussion. We've got a question from the audience, and this is around transparency. It says, hello, I've met one of your African reps last year. He has kept in touch. I did a review of CMB, and there were some reviews about legal actions, return of funds at the end of the projects, and some disclosures on timeframes for obtaining green cards. Can you address these, please? So I think that, I would say likely the starting point would be return of funds at the end of the project versus eligibility for return of capital would be a good thing to get into. And then disclosure on timeframe of obtaining green cards and USCIS processing is certainly a clarification that needs to be had.
Sure. So let's speak to that a little bit. So number one, the USCIS and the rules governing the EB-5 program set the first standard as far as when an investor becomes eligible to receive the return of their capital. But then in addition to that, you also have to look at how the documents are structured, because the regional centers, and CMB will do this, we will go above and beyond to make sure that we're careful about that exposure. So let's jump back to the USCIS side of it. When you make your EB-5 investment, the USCIS requires that you make a full investment. You're fully invested, that the full 1.8 million or 900,000 truly goes into the project. And then it remains in the project through the period of conditional permanent residency, or the sustainment period. And they've defined that period as 2 years from the point in time in which you received your conditional green card. At the end of that time period, you technically, by USCIS standards, become eligible to receive the return of your capital. But what's really important is that, just because you become eligible doesn't mean you have an automatic right to redeem your investment at that point in time. You have to look at the way in which the documents were structured. And a lot of the EB-5 loans, whether they be equity investments or whether they be loans that are out there, they have different standards in time in which someone becomes eligible to receive their capital. In the earlier days, most of CMB's investments were structured to require that the investor actually receive approval of their I-829. And that's because in the earlier days, it wasn't as clearly defined as far as when an investor truly became eligible to receive the return of their capital. It wasn't until 2017 in which they went a step beyond in policy memorandum to truly define the sustainment period as that 2 years ending at the point in time in which that conditional green card initially expires. So what you'll see in a lot of EB-5 investments is you may reach that period, but you may not actually become eligible under the documents that you signed up for to receive the return of your capital. At that point in time, it's important to maintain open lines of communication with the regional center and with your immigration attorney as far as, when you become eligible and what the regional center's plan is for returning that capital. Most of our loans are 6-year loans. And so in most cases, we require that the full loan has been repaid, that loan has been repaid, and that the partnership receive at least one I-829 approval. In some instances, based on the structure of the partnership, we've allowed that process to take place earlier. And so typically when the loan is fully repaid, we start the process of returning capital to any eligible limited partners rather than redeploying those funds. I hope that helps answer the question. But why I mention it, and I mention it in the context of the whole industry, is every EB-5 regional center project is different. If it's an equity investment, you may never have, some sort of put or redemption option. You may be at the mercy of being able to sell your equity investment or waiting for, the project, the general partner to liquidate or what have you. So it just really depends on the structure that's in place.
Thank you. Here's another question, Matt. Is it important for a project to be pre-approved?
So I love this question. This is a great question. I'm sure Mark will have an opinion on this as well. But, one of the things we see, and it kind of goes into the marketing category, if you ask me, is we see a lot of projects out there marketing themselves as 924 approved or pre-approved projects. And let me give you a little background, a little history on this. In the earlier days of EB-5, I-526 petitions were adjudicated relatively quickly. I remember when I started back in 2011, our senior management team was frustrated because it had taken over 3 months for one of our projects to receive its first I-526 petition approvals. And they were saying, how can it possibly take them more than 3 months to review one of these petitions? There's so few on file. But as the industry became bigger and bigger, and there were more regional centers out there, and there were more investors learning about EB-5 and moving forward with EB-5 investments, those adjudication timelines started to grow a little bit. And what we saw starting maybe 2013, 2014, was we saw some strategies being implemented by regional centers to go out and file 924 petitions, because the 924 petition, or an exemplar approval, which is actually an I-526 petition not associated to an investor, filed on the form I-924. What it does is it puts the petition in front of the USCIS without an individual investor associated to it, and it puts it there for review. Really, they're just reviewing the project itself. And what it does is it allows for a couple of things. You can use it to start a new regional center, amend a regional center, or receive an exemplar approval, meaning pre-approval, right? Knowing that you've structured something that will likely be successful if replicated. And so we saw a lot of regional centers filing those petitions because they had a much shorter adjudication timeline. And then their hope was that once they received that approval, they could interfile it with all of the other I-526 petitions, and it would help speed up the processing of those I-526 petitions as those timelines grew. That kind of morphed into regional centers going out there and receiving project pre-approval and then using it as a marketing tool and saying, hey, look, I'm just as good as CMB because my project's pre-approved. I'm just as good as all the best regional centers in the industry, even though I have no track record, I have no history, I have no proven ability to get investors through this process. I have this pre-approval, which says that if you invest in my project, you'll get an approval also. The fact of the matter is today, I think it's important to question whether or not there's even such a thing as a pre-approved project, because the regulations have changed. Back in November of last year, the regulations changed. So any project that was submitted, adjudicated, and approved before that point in time that used to market themselves as pre-approved, I think it's fair to question whether or not the USCIS would rubber stamp the same approval for any new petition filed on this side of those new regulatory changes. The other thing I always like to mention is that timeline for 924 pre-approval has also grown. Now it's, I think, somewhere between 18 and 24 months on average, which means those regional centers are submitting old projects. They're submitting petitions to the US government for pre-approval. They're getting it pre-approved, but they're not coming out to market it to you until maybe 2 years later. And so if you're seeing a project that's saying that it's pre-approved, you still need to do your due diligence. You still need to question everything. A lot of times those regional centers will tell you, hey, because I have this pre-approval, USCIS has to provide deference and there's no chance that they'll deny your petition. Well, that's false. Because if that regional center has changed any of the, has materially changed any of the documents, if they've had to restructure the project from a, job creation standpoint or from a cost standpoint, if the timelines have changed significantly, the USCIS will re-adjudicate your I-526 petition, and there's no guarantee that they will approve that petition. They reserve the right to continue to adjudicate those petitions if there's been changes from the original 924. And I think it's fair to say that if those two things are 2 years apart, there's probably going to have been some changes in the overall structure of that project that you need to be concerned about. So when I look at people marketing 924 pre-approved projects, number one, right now I question, is that even such a thing because the regs have changed? And then I say, great, you have a 924 pre-approval, but it still requires that investors do due diligence, and an investor should still be aware that there's no guarantee that your project will be approved. What I like to say is that the regional center, and it was a point on the last slide, the regional center matters. We've structured over 75 EB5 partnerships. We have over 5,700 investors who have moved forward with EB5. Right now, over 4,800 of those investors have received I-526 approvals. So we don't need a 924 pre-approval to tell you that we know how to structure an EB5 deal. We've been able to build that roadmap ourselves. We have over 4,800 of those approvals, not just one. We have 4,800 of them. So what's the stock in the 924? Well, a lot of regional centers are out there saying, hey, it levels the playing field. It makes me just as good as CMB. Well, that's false. I think you need to look at their history. You need to look at our history, and then you can determine for yourself, what the value is in that 924 pre-approval.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Matt said. I mean, over the years, I've seen so many projects come out there and say, oh, it's pre-approved. You must have a pre-approval. And there's no obligation on USCIS to approve your I-526 just because there's a template pre-approval. And in fact, there are projects out where that hasn't happened. And investors say, well, I was told that this is pre-approved. So why is it that my I-526 is having difficulties for project-based reasons? And it's because for exactly the reasons Matt explained. It's a Templar approval, a pre-approval does not equate to approval of I-526. So, I think that we work with lots of regional centers, and I could list, like there's 3 or 4 in the industry that I view as sort of ahead of the pack in terms of ethics and responsibility. And when I speak to the leaders of those regional centers, they all agree on this point, that all of them will tell you the same thing, that the pre-approval is of limited value. It's not valueless, but it's of limited value. And it's very wrong for regional centers to be marketing that their project is pre-approved, so your case won't have any difficulties. If you're being told that, the 4 or 5 biggest regional centers in the industry disagree with them.
Yeah. One more thing to add to it, look, is there potential that, a 924 could be filed and you could get a very early adjudication of that 924? Sure. And Mark hit the nail on the head. It's not that it's valueless. It's just that you still have to do your due diligence. What I would ask is if you're looking at a project, one other thing I'd mention is there's projects out there right now saying that they're going to provide, or that they've been pre-approved to allow for expedited processing. Well, again, I think most of those projects, or any of the projects that I know of that are out there saying that, filed those petitions and received expedited processing on those petitions, on the other side of those regulations. And some of them, one of them, was even all the way back in 2017 or 2018 when they were approved for that expedited processing. So I also think it's important to go challenge the regional center and say, well, when did you file this 924? What's changed since then? The petition that I filed today, is it going to be the same petition that you filed back in 2018, 2019? Or is it going to have changed in some way? Your immigration attorney should be evaluating the changes that have taken place. Do they create additional risk for you in some way, shape, or form? Or do they invalidate the claims of the regional center? If I was considering a project that's out there saying that it's, approved for expedited processing, I sure as heck would be saying, okay, show me a petition that was filed on this side of the regulations and show me a petition that's been approved on this side of the regulation. And, show me the approval of that petition. I'd want to know that. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I think another really good question, Matt, is with some of these expedite projects, ask them, what is the longest processing time you've had on an I-526? And you'll find with some of them, they're bigger than a year. So, what does expedite mean? You can have discussions about 90 days periods and things, but as a practical matter, there are investors around the world who feel that they've invested in an expedited project only to be sorely, sorely disappointed by the processing time. And, we made the point at the beginning of this webinar about there's two things, right? There's getting your green card and getting your money back. Well, under the getting your green card category, remember this, just because you get your I-526, it doesn't mean you're going to get your I-829. So you always need to think about that. And then the second point is in terms of, the project needs to make sense as a business investment. I think one of them, perhaps the one you're talking about, you need to go walk the site. You need to see it for yourself. You need to ask industry experts about the business concept. You need to look at the way it's structured, and you need to come to a conclusion of, do I think that I've got just as much chance of getting my money back in this project as I have in a CMB project or anyone else's project? And I think that's a very serious thing for you to think about. Is one, am I going to get my I-829? And two, how does this project look in terms of, and am I going to get my money back? Mm-hmm. Now we have investors who have, $1 billion plus, and we've got one with a couple with Matt, $1 billion plus balance sheets. So if you're in that category, maybe you don't care too much about $500,000. Maybe you don't care too much about 900,000. But for a lot of investors with their hard-earned money, these expedite projects really raise some significant risk questions to your family's wealth, the health of your family's financial wealth. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, we always talk about the goals of the investor, and you've heard us bring it up. Number one goal of any EB-5 investor is getting your green card. Number two goal is getting your money back. And you can't lose track of both of those goals. Number one, you want that green card. You wouldn't be doing an EB-5 investment if it wasn't for the prospects of getting a green card. But you should look at that second goal as well. Never look at the 924 pre-approval or, an expedite as being the sole reason why you chose the project. You might jeopardize both of those goals. It's important to just consistently do your due diligence every time you have the opportunity to do it.
Guys, there's a question that piggybacks a bit on some of the discussion you were just having. So why are some regional centers paying significantly higher rates of return for my investment than others?
Yeah.
Can I start on this, Matt, and then flip to you?
Absolutely.
Because I'm sort of a little bit neutral, right? We work with multiple different regional centers. And so, I have to be careful what I say, not to constitute financial advice. But to me, if I was a regional center operator and I could raise all the money I wanted to and pay investors 0.5% or 1% interest, from just sort of as nice in the world as person as I might be, why am I going to pay someone 4% when I can fill my project with investors at 1%? It doesn't make any sense. And I think to me, as just, as a lay person in a financial context, that's the thing that always strikes me is, why is it that this regional center can't raise enough investors in this project at a lower rate of interest? And then when you look at the project, you often find that there's, risk. So I'm not saying that there's a perfect risk reward curve on these things, because there probably isn't, and I'm not licensed to comment on that anyway. But the projects that offer a higher rate of interest, when we've really done the legal due diligence, we find issues. We usually find issues. So with that, Matt, I'll let you answer the question.
Yeah, no, you know what, Mark, you said it very well. And look, we look at it from two different perspectives. There's two different groups in my mind that are out there offering higher rates of return on the EB-5 investments. And traditionally, EB-5 deals have been structured to be low risk, or risk mitigated deals that are focused on green card and return of capital. There's a spread that's paid. Typically, the regional center earns the bulk of that interest that's paid. In our model, it's a loan, and we earn the bulk of the interest paid on that loan. And that helps us fund our operations, our ability to travel and come do site visits, to meet with you, to be able to employ the people that we have here that do due diligence, that do follow up. Now, if you want to work with a newer company that doesn't have an established track record, that doesn't have the team of professionals that we do, that work on these deals day in and day out, the likelihood is that they might pay you a little bit higher rate of return because they don't necessarily have the overhead that we have. They also don't have the track record that we have, so they need something else to serve as a marketing tool. We've seen this throughout the history of EB5. There's always going to be regional centers out there that will offer you some ridiculous rate of return. And they've almost kind of tempered that rate of return a little bit to make it not seem crazy. But there are a lot of regional centers that will offer you that higher rate of return. And it's a distraction from whether or not the regional center is truly capable of doing what they're saying they're going to do, because they know they have to incentivize you to move forward with them versus someone who's a leader in the industry. The other side of it is this, and we talked about it before, there's a developer-driven model that's out there, these vertically integrated regional centers. Well, if you're a developer and you've gone out and you've set up your own regional center and you're raising funds to pay for your own project and you've decided to structure that as debt, well, you control the cost of your own capital. You know, you're a developer, you're going to make money off the development of the deal. So what you do is you set the interest rate that you're willing to pay based on what you think is going to incentivize the investors to move forward. They're controlling their own cost of capital. And so they might say, hey, I'm willing to pay 4%. I'll just give that 4% to the investors. But then again, you're still in one of those structures that could be easily conflicted and could be compromised. Developer controls the ability of whether or not they're going to take, whether or not they're going to pay that debt. They determine that. There's no advocate there that says that if the project goes south, someone has to force them to service that debt. They can just stop paying that debt. We've seen this in a very notable project that's out there right now. One of the largest regional center projects that's out there is not paying its dividends to its investors. They've just simply chosen not to. I don't know. I'm not an expert on that deal. I don't know all the ins and outs, but it's very notable. You can Google that. But this is the exact situation that we're talking about. A developer that controls the cost of its own capital, a developer that can structure the deal the way that it wants. And when it hit financial hardship, it just stopped paying the investors. And so you also have to ask yourself, okay, again, do I want the green card? Do I want my money back? Or do I want the high rate of return? If you're going to go after that high rate of return, you might be compromising the other goals. It's just something to consider.
So Matt, would you maybe discuss the differences between an equity and a debt-based model, and in your opinion, which may be better?
Yeah, absolutely. So here, in the earliest days of EB5, I think most of the deals that were out there were structured as equity. And typically in an equity deal, you're going to have investors invest into some sort of fund that is going to be a direct equity participant, probably common equity, sometimes preferred equity in an actual deal. They're along for the ride, so to speak. Once they're an equity investor, they're at the bottom of the capital structure. They might be able to generate a little bit higher rate of return. They may be able to make some money on the overall sale or the exit of that deal, but they really don't have any control. They don't have rights. And one of the biggest obstacles that we see and that we saw in the earliest days of EB5 is that there's not really a guaranteed exit strategy or a timeline that allows the investors to say, hey, at this point in time, that's when I'll get my money back. It's all going to be subject to, sale of the asset or, the investor selling their own equity share, their own share. So in 1997, CMB actually rolled out our first loan model. It was the very first time we used our loan model. And the whole reason why we did that is because we said, wait a minute, these investors, most of the investors that we're talking to, they want their green card, they want their money back, they want out. And so they want some certainty into, when it is they can get their capital back. If we come out and we have a 6-year loan structure, they know at the end of that 6 years, that loan matures and we have collateral. The borrower is going to be, we're going to underwrite this such that there's a likelihood that it's going to get repaid at maturity or before that. And if it doesn't, we'll go pursue our collateral remedies and we'll force the borrower to repay us at that time. And so typically the way a loan model works is that and the way ours works is we have a limited partnership that we structure. Investors invest into that limited partnership, and that limited partnership makes a loan to a borrower. It's governed by a loan agreement, again, with a defined maturity date and collateral and rights and things of that nature and terms and conditions that the borrower has to abide by. CMB serves as the general partner of that partnership and enforces the terms and conditions of that loan agreement. Right now, I'd tell you, I think that the scales have tipped. When I first joined in 2011, there's still a lot of equity models out there. I think right now, the vast majority of deals that you see out there are structured as debt. They use that loan model. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've heard bluntly people on the preferred equity side say preferred equity is always better. And I've certainly heard people on the debt side say debt is always better. And I think, to be honest, that's a lot of nonsense, because you could have a debt project structured really badly, right? Such that a preferred equity one is much, much better. Same thing vice versa. And, you know, a creative lawyer with preferred equity can structure all kinds of rights and things in there. So I really think you have to be honest, from my perspective, I really think you have to look at the individual project and the individual way that it's structured. I've just seen like the people say, typically a regional center that's arguing for equity will say something like, well, we've got equity too, or something like this. And so we're all on the same side. I've heard that one. That's a sort of dangerous thing too. But just to answer the question very directly, I think you have to read the two projects. If I'm given a preferred equity project and I'm given a debt structured project, I want to read them. I want to read them to understand the deal, to understand the way that the preferred equity is structured, because one could be worse than the other, but I don't really know till I read the documents. Mm-hmm. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree, because again, it always goes down to, you can't just not do your due diligence. You need to do that due diligence. And so the project matters, the regional center matters, the structure that they've used is going to matter. And so there are some projects that have been successful that are equity models. There are a lot that have been successful that are loan models. We prefer the loan model because we think it creates a little bit more defined exit strategy for the individual EB-5 investors. And we've had success with that model. And I think that's the model that we'll continue to stick to.
True. Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yep.
So Mark, what are the key questions as a client I should be asking my attorney about a project?
Well, first of all, the first question to ask the attorney is, what are they actually going to do on the project for you, right? The scope of their services. So we, for example, have some cases now from Vietnam. And the scope of the lawyer's role in those is very circumscribed. The agent is going to do a lot of the source of funds work. It's going to be reviewed potentially by a lawyer, and certainly the agent doesn't want the lawyer to have anything to do with due diligence on the project or the regional center. And there's sort of a little bit of conflict of interest there, in that, you know, if a lawyer starts saying too many things about the project, the agent's just going to say, sorry, we're going to use another lawyer. So you need to be mindful of what is the lawyer and what is it they're going to do for you, as question one. Questions that I would ask my lawyer to find out about the project is, I would want to know, what do you know about the regional center? What history do you have with the regional center? What do you know about the way they manage things? How do they manage escrow accounts? Are they sort of, you know, do you understand this? What is the regional center's role within this deal? Those questions I would ask. I would ask them, have you reviewed like the project documents from the perspective of like a real estate investor? So there's this common thing to say that everything's immigration law or it's financial or business. That's just a pack of lies. Yeah. So there are thousands and thousands of lawyers, literally and without exaggeration, across America, who are lawyers in really big law firms who do real estate due diligence on these kinds of deals. So I want to know, are you going to actually look at the project? I want to know, are you going to tell me about any sort of non-immigration risks that might occur to the project? So I gave an example earlier, a certificate of occupancy and reading a lease. Those two things, taking an opinion on those is the practice of law. If a financial advisor attempts to do that, he is practicing law without license, and in theory, can go to jail for that. So you need to be very clear as to what is the lawyer doing and what is the lawyer not doing for you. most of the time, I'll be very honest, with most of the projects I see, the green card perspective is not that bad. You know, people are looking at big regional centers, big projects from a, am I going to get my green card perspective? They're usually quite well structured. But in terms of structuring something so that your assets are protected from a capital preservation perspective, they're all over the map. You know, and I'm on CMB's webinar, but I don't mind saying that usually CMB projects are very tight on that. They're very well structured. There are some other other regional centers that are good too, but you know, most regional center projects bluntly are not. I would almost guarantee if you send me a set of project documents, I can find issues in it, unless it's really from one of the sort of top players in the industry. So that's what I would ask my lawyer, is how deeply are they going into it? Are they so, and I'll ask Matt, you know, it's a question to me, but one of the big problems I see is where developers have played games with changing the ownership of the land to the project and the valuation. And so people think, well, you know, the developers put this ton of equity in here. Then you ask, well, what is it? It's land. And Matt, perhaps you can, you know, you've seen lots of these tricks in the industry. Yeah. Perhaps you can describe how that trick works and how investors are misled by it. But it's a lawyer's job to look at that.
We have, you know, a really notable one that we always used to use as an example. There's a regional center that was set up years ago that was building a water park off the 15 freeway in California. But this is in between Los Angeles and Nevada, and most people realize that that's basically a desert in between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And they own this piece of property that essentially had no value. In addition to that, this property was not located near an exit off this freeway, off this interstate. So you needed to, in order to get to this piece of property, you needed to, you know, pass the property or cut short and take what would be about a 15, 20-minute detour in order to make it to this piece of property. Well, the developer, wanting to offload this property, said, hey, you know, what could we build here? Decided to build a water park and said, hey, you know, we're out in the middle of the desert. You know, we're going to have a lot of traffic going back and forth between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. If we can capture, you know, 1/100th of the, you know, the traffic, or 1/1000th of the traffic that passes this every single day, we're going to make X amount of money. They put all these pro formas together. They put all these plans together. And the reality of the situation is that when they went to go build this water park, their only contribution was this piece of property that, based on its location and based on its inaccessibility, was virtually worthless, but they overinflated the value of this property to these EB-5 investors. And so when the EB-5 funds were raised, they were placed in conjunction with the developer's contribution, their equity contribution, that was this overinflated piece of property. The developer essentially pulled the EB-5 funds, pulled development fees and things of that nature out of the EB-5 funds. The water park got built, you know, so fortunately, I think some of the investors were able to get their green cards. But as soon as the developer pulled all of their developer fees, which were probably also overinflated, the developer basically just walked away from the project. And what they had done is found a really easy way to create this capital infusion from EB-5 investors that allowed them to pull development fees off of building this property and this project that had no chance at ever being successful, but it allowed the developer to get more value than they ever could than if they were to just have sold that piece of property as is. And so we've seen this go terribly wrong in EB-5 in a number of different ways. That's just one example.
So I think a question to ask your lawyer is, do they have experience with real estate deals? With do they even know what mezzanine finance means? Most of them don't. So, for example, earlier in my career, Matt mentioned it, right at the beginning of my career, I remember a deal whereby the bank that we represented had invested in a project in the middle of the desert, in the same area of the United States. And they were building this development, this town, and nobody had really been there. Nobody had checked, and nobody had thought to check that there was any connection to the highway system. So they basically had this like town they were building in the middle of the desert, and it wasn't going to be connected by roads to anything. And that's why it went into restructure and problems and a workout. So So, ask your lawyer, what experience do you have with real estate transactions? Forget EB5. Ask them, outside the purview of EB5, name all of the real estate transactions of significance that you've been involved with. I think that would be a very good question, because the type of thing that Matt just talked about, someone who's got a lawyer who's got experience with structuring real estate backed projects, that's really due diligence 101. And then secondly, the point I mentioned earlier, ask them, are you insured to do that kind of review? Because if I had a client in Matt's project and I didn't tell them that and they lost their money, I would guarantee there's going to be a claim against me at a law firm. I'm liable for not having, a reasonable lawyer would be expected to find that kind of risk. If I'm saying I do immigration only, I have nothing to do there with that, I get off the hook. Now, perhaps I don't if I also tell the client that they don't tell the client they not to see the real estate lawyer, which is a subject of a lot of litigation right now. These immigration lawyers who say this is all you don't need a real estate lawyer, are getting sued. And so I would ask the lawyer, have you seen this kind of transaction? Do you have experience with it? And are you insured to do this? Because if something bad happens and I'm insured to do it, you've got a, certainly not guaranteed, but you've got a possible avenue of recovery from my insurer for not finding that work. And that's standard. A big bank, like for example, in my career, I've been in deals with my firm's represented Goldman Sachs, they've represented what used to be Lehman in these kinds of deals. Why does a bank like that, with a massive with an in-house law department bigger than most law firms, hire an outside counsel law firm to do this type of due diligence on the deal? There's only one reason. It's because if something else goes wrong, they want someone else to have hung their hook on the, sort of their hat on the hook, if you will, and have someone to go after. And it's a bit of CYA too. So that's, sort of my answer to sort of some of the things to ask your lawyer.
Perfect. Thank you. Looks like we've got time for like one more question here. So what are the parameters around redeployment of my funds if I have not received my visa, and will this affect when my investment is returned?
Sure. And actually, I'll jump into this one because, I think this goes in tandem to the question that was asked earlier. And I've reread the question that was up there, and I think that the individual was speaking to a couple of different things in their questions, rumors that they had heard. And something that's really important that I want to address is that, when you're a regional center that has taken on a lot of projects and you've worked with a lot of clients, you're going to have clients who have different motivations and who have different frustrations with the timelines associated to receiving their capital back or receiving their green card. And I think the reference was made earlier about legal actions. We've had investors sue CMB and say, hey, well, I didn't realize it was going to take me longer. This is particularly Chinese investors who have a very long backlog. And this individual sued CMB and said, hey, I want my capital back because I didn't realize it was going to take me this long to get my green card. Well, we actually disclose all of these things to the investors. And so it is very important that you work with your immigration attorney to ask all those questions, get advice on those sorts of things, and that you read all the disclosures in the offering documents. This investor did review all of these things. They were frustrated, they were disgruntled. And ultimately it was our decision that we could not, and our documents could not allow, nor would the program allow, for us to just simply give somebody their money back. In this particular situation, this investor still wanted to pursue their green card, so they would not abandon their immigration pursuit. And the immigration law requires that you have to maintain your investment. If we were just to simply give them their money back without having them abandon their immigration pursuit, we actually would have created an impermissible debt arrangement. We actually would have created a redemption agreement for them that allowed them to get their capital back before they became, eligible under the guise of the EB-5 program. And so that's a good segue into redeployment. And because I think part of this person's concern was whether or not it was going to take them longer to get their green card and therefore get their capital back. And so when we talk about redeployment, first of all, redeployment really centers around investors from countries who face immigration backlogs or visa backlogs. And right now, so primarily investors from China, Vietnam, and India who will face some backlog. Right now, India is current. However, it's projected, I think, that there'll be some sort of a backlog. And in the event that it takes them more than 6 years to get through their immigration process and become eligible to receive their capital back, or if there were to be some sort of early repayment of the loan before they complete that 2-year sustainment period that we talked about earlier, there's potential that we would have to redeploy those funds into a new at-risk venture. And typically the way CMB redeploys our funds is very simple. The USCIS back in 2017 put some policy memoranda out that that described what was appropriate for redeployment. One of the things they mentioned was that you could make, if you were structured to make business loans, you could make new business loans. And so that's what we do. We look at opportunities to make new business loans. Sometimes they're short-term loans to operating entities. Sometimes they are new ground-up development loans. Sometimes they are bridge loans that are going to be replaced by some other financing in a shorter or predictable period of time. And when we look at those redeployment opportunities, we try and match those up with the timelines and the needs of the individual EB-5 investors in that partnership that may require redeployment. Redeployment is one of those hot button issues right now because there's constant changes and questions being asked of the USCIS on how redeployment should take place, what should happen, how it should be governed. And, it's one of these things that the industry is looking at as a new challenge that everyone's going to have to deal with. But frankly, CMB has been redeploying funds in our partnerships since 2014. We have a long track record and history of clients who have had to have their funds redeployed, who now do have I-829 petition approvals, and who do have their funds returned to them. So it's something that we've been doing for a long time, and that we have a lot of expertise in doing.
Thank you, Matt. Well, a sincere thank you from all of us for sharing your time and staying throughout the entire presentation. We hope you found this to be a valuable resource while considering and planning a move to the United States and learning more about due diligence on EB-5 projects. Please feel free to use the contact information on your screen at this time. We will be planning on sending a video link out for today's event. If you'd like to watch again or even share with family and friends, you should expect to receive a follow-up email in the coming next days to provide links and contact information again as well. And again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you stateside.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, guys.